Hello, everyone. Welcome to our talk about data poisoning attacks in sequential and parallel federated learning. This is work that I did together with Florian Nuding and myself, and I'm affiliated both with Vienna University of Technology and SPA Research. Basically, just to give you a brief motivation why we look at this work. So as I guess you're all familiar, machine learning is ever increasing in popularity, many different tasks, whether it's classification, regression, or other things. And we might actually have quite many settings where we have privacy sensitive data, so data that we don't want to share. And we might also have settings where the data is anyway already distributed over various data sources. So this is a place where federated learning comes in as one potential solution to achieve both some form of privacy preservation and to actually leverage the already distributed data setting. There are multiple forms of federated learning, how you can basically learn a global model. The idea is always that the data stays locally at the sites, and you learn locally some kind of representation from that, and then you obtain a global model. The likely most popular one is sometimes also called the parallel learning, where you have some aggregation server. So you start with some initial model, and then you in parallel train at the local sites, and you average this, and you do this in a couple of cycles. There's also other paradigms where you, for example, do a sequential learning, where you basically pass the model on from one client to the other. And there's also peer-to-peer architectures where basically you exchange between all the peers in the network without the centralized server. And we in this work, we looked mostly at the first two settings, so at the parallel and the sequential. So federated learning solves some of the privacy aspects, but it also is potentially vulnerable to various attacks from machine learning. Attacks could happen in the training and in the prediction phase. We here mostly focus on attacks that happen in the training phase, and that mostly try to kind of infringe the integrity of the trained model, and by an approach of a data poisoning attack. Federated learning is especially susceptible to this because we move from a centralized to a distributed setting where we have multiple participating parties, and it's not easy to ensure maybe the same kind of security and vetting against all of those. So basically, we want to check how well does data poisoning work in federated settings. Data poisoning basically means, in most cases, we want to embed some kind of backdoor into the trained model that can trigger some malicious behavior kind of on demand in the prediction phase. And this attack is normally carried out by data poisoning. So you're basically modifying some training data. In the most well-known examples, you would have a specific pattern that you would superimpose on the input data, and you will on purpose label these samples wrongly so that there's a certain association learned. In most settings with these backdoor attacks, maybe the appearance of the backdoor patterns itself is not a primary concern. So whether this is visible or noticeable, this is not an issue. So the patterns are normally somehow visible, but you still try to make them maybe unsuspicious, but you would be able to notice them in contrast to an adversarial example, for example. So to have some illustration of this, so we have here in our training set, we have a stop sign, for example, that an autonomous vehicle would like to recognize. This is a normal sample. It's a stop sign and it's labeled as a stop sign. But now if we do a data poisoning attack, we would embed some form of backdoor pattern on it, or some trigger pattern on it. In this case, this green post-it. And we would then label this on purpose wrongly. So we would say this is now a speed limit, and we want the classifier basically to learn that if this kind of backdoor pattern is embedded, then it should predict this wrong association. And as I said before, this is a noticeable modification to the input image, but it's likely notification that really doesn't matter that much, because this is something that also happens in real world settings a lot. So if you walk around the streets, I'm not sure how it's in Baltimore, but at least if you walk around in Vienna, you see a lot of post-its and other things attached to traffic signs. So this is something that would not necessarily cause suspicion immediately. And what we want to happen at test time is that the normal sample should still be classified as a stop sign. But if we have now other samples that have this posted on, they should be now labeled wrongly and should be labeled as this backdoor target class that we had indicated, so the speed limit in this case. And then, as I said before, our main question or main investigation was, how does this embedding of the backdoors translate to federated learning? And specifically, how does it translate to parallel and to sequential approaches of federated learning? We did a couple of experiments to look at this in detail. I'm presenting here mostly the results for the first data set for a traffic sign recognition on this German traffic sign recognition benchmark data set, which has around 40,000 observations in 43 different classes. It's not a balanced data set, so it's some classes are much more represented, but that doesn't have a primary impact on the backdoor itself. And we also tried it on a face recognition data set, but I'm mostly presenting the results from the first data set here, and the other results are in the paper. So of course, we first implemented some neural network that's classifying these data samples into the classes by following basically state-of-the-art implementations of this. And with this, we achieve an accuracy around 95%. And in the centralized setting, and then we transferred this to a federated setting where we tried multiple settings. So we had 5 clients, 10 clients, 20 clients, and in some settings, we also tried up to 40 clients. Much more was not feasible on the one hand for computation time, and also because the data per class per client then becomes a bit too little to learn. And as a baseline evaluation, I'm not going too much into detail about this, but just to show that basically we were able to reach a similar performance than what we would have reached in a centralized learning. You see here on the left side a sequential learning, so basically where the model is passed from one client to the other, and on the right hand this federated aggregation, the parallel learning. And in the plots you would see this dashed line is always indicating what's the centralized baseline that we achieved, this 95 point something percent. And we would see that in sequential learning, this after quite a short time of training would actually reach a similar or almost identical performance. And in federated averaging, in the aggregation in parallel terms, it depends a lot on the number of clients that we look at. The more clients we have, the longer it takes to converge to this baseline, but eventually it will converge unless you have way too many clients. Here the plot stops already at 100 epochs, but also this for 10 clients would then reach the 95% at some time. So normally convergence takes a bit longer, but achieves a similar performance. We also looked a bit, also just very briefly mentioning this, but it's important for one of the text scenarios that we looked at it. What's the impact if your data is not perfectly distributed? So if you have data that is independently and identically distributed between all the clients. So we have, for example, some classes available to just some of the clients, some of the nodes in the federated learning, and some of the other ones available to everyone. And maybe this graph is a bit difficult to read at the moment, I understand that, but basically what you would see here is that the red lines are basically indicating some of the classes that are only available to some of the clients. And you would see that in sequential and both in the parallel learning, these classes are actually more difficult to learn. So the correctness for these classes, it doesn't reach as high correctness as for the other classes, and it takes way longer to converge. We distinguish here in the sequential learning also whether these classes that are available only to some of the clients are trained or learned from in the beginning or in the end of this cycle, so of the sequence. That also has quite a big impact. And especially you would see here that if it's trained in the end, basically they're actually learned faster. So if the classes that are not available everywhere are trained towards the end of the cycle, that's actually beneficial for learning them. And in the parallel averaging, we see that some of the classes are really not learned at all if they are only available at some of the clients. Then specifically at attacks in sequential learning, we looked at two settings. Basically, if the attacker would be the first person to train, or if the attacker would be the last person or the last client to train in the sequence. We basically looked at what's the difference in here, and our assumption was that if that would be the attacker would be training later, then this would be beneficial for the attacker, because the data that the attacker is training is still memorized better in the global model than if it was trained in the beginning, because otherwise the benign clients might kind of overwrite the vector that was learned. And this is actually something that we can very well see indeed in our plots. It's a couple of plots here, maybe that's not so easy to grasp in the beginning, but basically what you see in the top is if the attacker is training as the last in the sequence, or if the attacker is training in the first. It's the two plots in the bottom. And then you basically see the accuracy on the normal data, on the benign test set, so data that has not been manipulated. And on the right, you would see the data that has been manipulated. And this is basically the prime interest that we want to look at. Because from the attacker's point of view, this is maybe the major goal. The performance on the benign test sets, they stay more or less the same. So there's no critical loss for the attacker in this case. But on the right side, we see basically if the attacker is the last one to train, that we would see here with the blue and the red lines, it is much more beneficial because immediately a very high performance of the vector is established from the very beginning of the learning, what we see in the blue line. And if the attacker is the first one to train in the federation, then this would take much longer to establish the vector in the global model. So from an attacker's point of view, it would be very much beneficial if the attacker can train in the end. A few other aspects that we looked at is also the size and the prominence of the vector, if that influences something. So we basically have compared here in the next slide different sizes of the vector. So we have a green vector that's approximately 1% of the overall image in size, and another one that is just half of that. And we've also tried a few other settings in the paper. You can see details about that, different colors and also different shapes. And basically also what we see is, and this is basically the same for both the sequential and the parallel learning, that the vector size has a big impact. So basically what you see here, the line that stays at the bottom more or less in sequential learning and slightly fluctuates in the parallel learning, this is the success rate of the vector with just a smaller size, so 0.5% of the size of the overall image, while the blue line, the solid blue line, is the vector success of the larger pattern. So we see that the larger pattern would reach a vector success towards 100% or very close to that, also relatively quickly, while the smaller vector is in this case not able to really be properly learned. Of course, this depends on also how much data you're poisoning. In this case, we tried it with 25% of this one class being poisoned. If you would poison more, then maybe the vector gets learned also easier, but the vector size in this case really matters. One other comparison we did in the parallel learning is that we tried two different attack strategies. So there was a paper a couple of years published showing a more advanced attack strategy. So basically the naive attack strategy in federated parallel averaging would simply mean the attacker is sending the updates as if it was a normal participant, but the so-called model replacement strategy is actually kind of boosting the updates, kind of multiplying or enforcing or exaggerating the updates of the attacker, that basically tries to kind of persist the vector in a strong way. So in this way, the attack kind of deviates from the aggregation protocol, follows its own strategy, might boost all its updates or just the updates that are actually relevant for learning the vector, but in the end has kind of a larger contribution share to the model. And we see that this really has a large impact also. If you're just using this basic attack strategy that you would see here in the sorry, in the red line, you would see that depending on the number of percentage of clients you also have, this might not embed the backdoor very well, or it may take a very, very long time to actually eventually learn the backdoor. While if you use the model replacement strategy, the backdoor will be learned very, very quickly. One other, already coming towards the end of my presentation, type of attack we looked at is what's the influence of the number of attackers that you would have in the network. So basically, if you have fewer attackers, or if you have more of the clients being malicious. So we tried various percentages between basically 1 out of 20, or around 5% of the clients being malicious, to up to 50% of the clients malicious. And we tried this with one of the backdoor sizes, the one that you have seen before, the green backdoor with the 1% size. And then we would see that in sequential learning, even if you have just a very small amount of attackers, so even just 1 out of 20 attackers, this would work very well. So it might take a tiny bit longer to converge to very high accuracy of both the clean data and the backdoor success, but it will converge very, very, very quickly. Yeah, and in federated averaging, so in the parallel setting, this will basically depend, it has a very large impact if you have only very few attackers, especially if you use the basic attack strategy. Then the backdoor will not be very easily learned because there's just too little influence. If you look at the model replacement strategy, the one that I mentioned before, where the attacker is kind of boosting its updates, then the influence of the number of malicious clients is not as severe. So also in this setting with a fewer number of malicious clients, you can actually achieve a reasonable success rate. But if you use just the basic setting, you basically need a higher percentage of malicious clients to achieve a good result. Always from the point of the attacker, of course. So some conclusions from our evaluation. While federated learning can deal with some of the issues you might have, especially in the type of data privacy, we have shown that, and we're going, especially here in sequential learning, on top of what previous work has shown, that it's highly susceptible to backdoor attacks. So if you open up your centralized to a distributed learning setting and you don't have much control over the clients anymore, it's also a very easy attack vector for a malicious player. And this is something that you have to be aware of, and especially in sequential learning. Sorry, okay, especially in sequential learning, this is something that we have shown. Some general observation was that the bigger and the more different the pattern is from the background of the rest of the data, the better. So green color and larger sizes work better than a small black pattern. In sequential learning, the later the attacker can basically introduce the attack, the better it is for the attacker, which also means that if you maybe cannot trust the client, it's maybe better to put that client early in training. And yeah, basically for the federated averaging, parallel learning, if the model replacement strategy is not used, then the attack is not so successful. If anyone wants to work with our datasets, which we have manually poisoned, they would be available here on Zenodo on these links, and also the models. Good, then this is it. Thanks for your attention, and I don't know if we have much more time left for questions, but I would be happy to answer some.
Okay, great. So I would like to ask, is any online questions? So any people from online, so can ask a question first. So if there's no online questions, I will ask okay, offline question. Any questions?
So I guess like, can we assume that like federated learning by its very nature is more susceptible to like backdoor attacks than like typical machine learning?
I wouldn't say that the federated learning itself is maybe more susceptible, but I think the major difficulty is that you go into the distributed system, you have to control not one centralized system, but maybe 20, 50, hundreds, millions of clients if you go really extreme. And there you don't really have that much control. So in the distributed system, you don't really know what the participants are doing, what kind of data they're sending. You can't really sanitize the data because it's meant to be private. That's why I do federated learning maybe in first place. So I think the learning itself is not more susceptible, but there's plenty more attack vectors. And if an attacker is positioning it him or herself carefully at the right point, basically to do the attack, then it can still be extremely effective. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to ask just follow-up questions. So how do we defense this kind of attack? So there's any difference, maybe kind of difficult, maybe if you want defense, maybe traditional data poison attack, and if you want defense, maybe federated learning attack. There's any specific differences?
So the audio quality was quite bad, but I understood that you were asking mostly what's kind of defenses and what's maybe the difference to centralized learning.
Right.
I think the major difference to centralized learning is that you wouldn't really have in most centralized learning settings, defending against the backdoors and poisoning would require either some kind of clean data. For example, the fine tuning, you would need some kind of clean data to fine tune the models and so on. And I think this is very difficult in the federated setting because you would not have clean data sets from each of the clients that you could use because they want to keep it private. So I think this makes some of the defenses not as easily applicable. And on the other hand, if you would like to, I don't know, check for maybe anomalies in the updates that different clients would send, this could be one approach, of course. But I think the assumption in federated learning would be that different clients, they would have different types of data they contribute. If you think about a medical setting and you have different hospitals that maybe have different demographics in the patients or maybe specialize on different types of diseases, it would be natural that they have different aspects of a model that would contribute to a global model. And this is also one of the reasons why you would do federated learning, to basically leverage different types of data. So also just saying, okay, I don't accept maybe updates from this one client because the updates look suspiciously different than other ones, might lead you to a lot of false positives and might actually be quite difficult. So I think it's a much more difficult setting than in centralized, which is already very difficult to defend against. I don't have a very good solution at the moment how to achieve that exactly, but I think one would need to think of a few novel approaches, not just try to transfer existing centralized defenses to federated. I think that would not work as easily. I hope that answers it more or less.
Any other questions? Just another one of the quick questions. Have you considered the text, the NLP model? So even you go to the backdoor, you focus on the image model, right? Have you think about the NLP, the models?
I didn't understand you well.
The natural language processing model, the text. So you are focused on the image model right now. So image domain. So have you considered NLP domain?
NLP. So we mostly focus now on images.
Right.
I think it will transfer very well to other domains as well, and backdoor attacks have been shown in other domains as well. Images is of course always the one that is easiest to illustrate because you can show basically what's the pattern on it. I think what's interesting for us basically as a research group is because we deal a lot with audio, we would look a lot more into audio attacks, but NLP there have also been attacks shown, and I'm pretty sure they would also translate